So here we are accusing the communists of being the promoters of big government, when really it's been the Federal Reserve that has promoted the building of the biggest government that history has ever known. It's our government, it's not the communists. Stop and think about the amount of people that are involved working for the federal government, and we're huge. It's massive. Paul correctly notes that the Fed is not so independent. It's in fact a very political institution due to how it's a government-created monopoly that has numerous employees appointed by the government. Ex-New York Fed President Bill Dudley demonstrated this lack of independence in recent comments. Dudley stated, Trump's re-election arguably presents a threat to the United States and global economy. And if the goal of monetary policy is to achieve the best long-term economic outcome, the Fed's officials should consider how their decisions would affect the political outcome of 2020. Realize what he's saying? He's saying we ought to use the levers of power to make sure Trump doesn't get reelected. So we're going to manipulate the dollar and the economy to prevent that. It's really ironic that their charter was about preserving the value of the dollar, and as he says here, if the goal of monetary policy is to achieve the best long-term economic outcome, if that's been their goal, then how come the value of the dollar has plummeted 97% since the inception of the Federal Reserve? You see, their goal was never to protect the U.S. dollar. Their goal was to make America as communist as they could by affecting monetary policy, by inflating the currency and inflating government. And they've done it very, very well. Ron Paul sees the Federal Reserve as a part of the deep state. He explained, whether it's the mainstream media, the CIA, the FBI, or now the Federal Reserve, more and more Americans are waking up to the fact that there is a deep state in America, and its interests have nothing to do with American liberty. In fact, our liberty is what the deep state wants to abolish. Paul believes that the Fed should be audited and then ended as soon as possible. The former congressman from Texas concluded with the following: America's founders were not perfect. They were human beings just as capable of error as we are, but they had a remarkable understanding of the ideas of liberty. They understood that liberty cannot exist with a government that has access to a printing press. Sound money and liberty go hand in hand. If we want to enjoy the blessings of liberty, we must audit and then end the Federal Reserve, which of course will never happen. Yes, Jim? We had a recent president that was, who was that?
John F. Kennedy.
John F. Kennedy.
Yes.
How interesting. Yeah. Well, and you know, if you are online or whatever, and occasionally you'll see advertisement type things on Yahoo, little blurbs, and they'll say, they'll talk about some actor or actress that's famous from the past, and they'll say, look at the crummy little house they live in now. You ever seen those? They'll say, wow, how sad to think of, you know. Well, yeah, the Federal Reserve has been robbing from people's retirement account from day one. How? From 1913 on. How? By inflating the currency. So people say, I'm going to save up $1 million for my retirement years, and that's going to be more than enough. Well, it sure was when you saved it. But by the time you get there to need it, suddenly $1 million won't buy hardly anything. Why? Because the government is robbing the future to pay for their expansion right now. And that's what Ron Paul's talking about. It is a scheme to make government bigger and rob from our future. And they've been doing it so effectively, and it's happened and continues to happen to this very day. Okay, Rusty, I'm not sure exactly where we were at on that video, but I know you know. So, you know about how many minutes in it is? Oh, look at that. Okay, perfect. Okay. So let's listen, and we'll stop it from time to time and comment. Okay.
Longer than it ever was before. And you see their puppet, Mr. Putin, attempting to reinstitute the Soviet Empire now.
They may have changed their name. They took their hat, which said Communist Commissar, across the top. They turn it around, and now it says entrepreneur or capitalist or social democrat or something. But it's the same hat on the same heads of the same Leninists.
Trial of communism should have finished that. It didn't happen, and therefore we are not out of that crisis. And that is the reason why we have Putin. That is the reason why you have Obama. It is still going on. The Cold War is going on. It's going on the streets of Moscow now. It's going on the streets of Tehran. It's going on really in America as well.
Let me give you, if I might, an example. They have a particular program they want to implement, and they go in and they ask for everything. They ask for everything, and they're aggressive about it. They push ahead. And so they push until they get opposition, starts to build up against it. And at that given moment, they evaluate the opposition. They say, well, is there any strength to it? Will it last? Will we be able to endure it? Or do we push ahead even farther? If the movement grows up to where it can do them harm, they then back off and say, well, maybe we don't want it all. Let's compromise a little. Let us get along together now.
But they got as much as they could get. Now, if you read their publications, they are boasting it's going to fail. It's not going to do the job. It's going to let people down. But that's great, because then they're going to blame the greedy insurance companies and the nasty doctors, and then they're going to push full on for single-payer healthcare. They're using the dialectic, they're using Lenin, they're using Hegel. Get what you can get, reach a compromise, then when the opposition backs off, then you go forward for the next step. And you just keep on doing that and doing that and doing that till you get what you want.
That strategy is what they use on every issue, every time. We will see a single-payer system implemented by our government in the near future. As Obamacare collapses, as it was designed to, they will step up to fix the problem of high premiums and a disgruntled people with more government. We never seem to learn. We keep compromising, keep giving up ground, and keep playing strictly defense, which is why we always lose.
We are in a dependent state, and when you go to the voting booth, you get to vote your self-interest. So, real issue, a real concern when you don't have a voting base with some skin in the game, as much to lose as to gain. What we know from history is that when you tip the scale at 51%, now you are talking about a license to steal. You're talking about that 51% tyranny that de Tocqueville was so concerned about. The democracy, for all its benefits, the main challenge is you get to the point where you have a 51% tyranny.
I think that it's underappreciated in our society just how extensive the damage of the welfare state is. And I think that when you look into the heart of the liberal and what they do to our society in the name of social justice or in the name of equality, it's evil will.
When a government is working as hard as possible to create dependency in their citizens, you know that their real aim is to eliminate freedom, because no man is truly free that is unable to provide for himself.
The dollar in America today, it takes 98 of them to buy what $1 did in 1913 when the Federal Reserve System was enacted into law. That is theft.
The fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto is to create a central bank. Ours was created in 1913 and is called the Federal Reserve.
You say Federal Reserve, and I think most Americans think that's part of the government. But of course, the Federal Reserve Bank isn't part of the government. The Federal Reserve is a private bank.
It's not a government institution. It's as Federal Express.
I'm sure the individuals involved would fit nicely into my chart if we knew their names, but we have allowed them to remain anonymous. They also tell us we do not have the authority to audit them to see how much of our money they have printed, even though with each bill they print, inflation soars. At the current rate of inflation, which most think is very modest, things go up in price 10 times every 50 years. My grandfather bought a nice house in 1915 for $4,500. My father bought a nice house in 1965 for $45,000. And my house today is $450,000. So if the rates of inflation just stay like they are, my grandson's house will cost him $4.5 million, and his grandson's $45 million.
Inflation is a tax. It's a hidden tax. And so it steals from people who have saved. When they finally retire at the end of a lifespan, all this money that they put aside doesn't buy anything anymore.
Houses haven't gotten more expensive. The dollar has just lost 97% of its value over the last 100 years. 1 ounce of gold would buy 300 loaves of bread 2,000 years ago, and an ounce of gold today will buy 300 loaves of bread. Prices rarely change. What's happened is the Federal Reserve has been quietly stealing our wealth while we believe their lie that inflation is normal. It wasn't normal for the first 6,000 years of Earth history. It magically started in America in 1913. Our economic system today is based on Keynesian economics. John Maynard Keynes is the father of it. If there is any doubt to the purposefulness of our economic situation, listen to this. He said, quote, "By a continuing process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens." Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch its currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction, and it does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose, unquote. The second plank of the Communist Manifesto is to implement a graduated income tax. Ours was placed into law in 1914.
If you establish a tax that is based on the government's power to determine what percentage of your income it's going to take away from you, how much of your income does it control? Well, that means the government controls 100% of your income. If that is the situation, you are no longer a free person. You are a slave, and you live on an allowance from your government.
When Ronald Reagan came into office, the top tax rate was 70%. When he left office, he had cut it down to 27%. During that same time, revenue to the government doubled. The lie of the left is that increasing taxes on the rich will help stimulate the economy, and nothing could be further from the truth. It's all a strategic part of the plan to create more dependency. People wonder why our free enterprise system isn't working anymore. It's because the inflation, taxation, and regulation is effectively killing its productivity and its ability to create wealth. So now people talk about redistributing the wealth we have instead of creating more. Every single person in the world could be a millionaire. Wealth is created by hard work, creativity, and ingenuity. The lie that it's a fixed pie is perpetrated by those that seek to pit the have-nots against the haves. If you add up all the debts and obligations our government has placed on us, every single individual owes over $650,000, which obviously isn't ever going to be paid back.
That's the nature of bankruptcy. And as one writer used to say, how did you go bankrupt? Well, very slowly and then all at once.
God said, "The borrower is servant to the lender." Artificially low interest rates have encouraged everyone to be buried in debt and enslaved to the banks. When you penalize productivity and reward sloth, you know exactly what you are doing. You are making us poorer as a nation, which will create more dependency, but of course, the cycle of history doesn't stop there.
And then you find that deterioration, that move towards dictatorship, which is the stage that follows dependency, where the vast majority of people are dependent on the state, and the only way to continue to deliver what the vast majority of people expect is via the strong arm of government.
Economic espionage. What jumped off the page for you? What stood out? Yes, Nancy? Federal Reserve. It's mind-boggling, isn't it? So one of the people he interviews in here is the author of the book, The Creature from Jekyll Isle, I think it is. And exactly examining the whole concept of the Federal Reserve. How interesting that he cites de Tocqueville. Who's de Tocqueville? Anybody remember? De Tocqueville? Remember the Frenchman that came to America and credited the pulpits in America as what made America great? But he also analyzed democracy, and he said, well, the only concern of democracy, of course, we have a representative democracy, but we still have a democracy. The only concern is when you get to 51% of the population dependent on government. Then all of a sudden, because people vote their self-interest, right? For example, we had a lady in our church in Portland, Oregon years ago, and when Ronald Reagan was elected president, she made it very clear how opposed she was to Ronald Reagan because she lived entirely on welfare. And she felt like, well, he's punishing me. It was interesting for us to hear. She was giving piano lessons to one of our kids, and it was interesting to just try and listen to her reasoning and to think about where she was coming from. But she had kind of been raised with the attitude of dependence on government. And so it was very upsetting to her that Ronald Reagan was suggesting that people on welfare should have to go work. And you know, I'm scratching my head and saying, how could we get to that point? And yet, we're much further along on that now than we were even at that time. Okay, social justice, equality, that's the kind of things there. He says, when a government is working as hard as possible to create dependency in their citizens, you know what their real aim is, to eliminate freedom, because no man is truly free that is unable to provide for himself. In what ways is the government trying to make us dependent on government? What programs can you think of when government is working as hard as possible to create dependency in their citizens? In what way is the government Medi-Cal? Healthcare? Wait a minute, isn't healthcare a constitutional right? That's what they're telling us. What did you say, Joe? You can't function without it, can you? All right. What else? Social Security. How interesting. To the point where many people go into retirement thinking they're trusting only in their house and Social Security, that's going to cover them, right? What else? Government paid cell phones. Isn't that something to think about? Yeah. All right. How about student loans? Oh, you can't exist without going to college. Yeah, but I can't afford it. That's okay. We're going to give you a real easy loan so you can afford it. And what's the result? It makes the student dependent, and it makes the college professors' salaries go up. I mean, if there was no student loan program, the colleges would have to be a lot more competitive in what they offer, wouldn't they? They couldn't jack up their prices nearly as easily, but oh my goodness, it's easy. You can just get a loan for $100,000. And so we end up then with students graduate from college and what? They're in debt for decades. I wonder if maybe that was by design. And the federal housing, we can go on and on and on about all the ways that the government is trying to make us dependent. The dollar in America today, it takes 98 of them to buy what $1 did in 1913. And yet that was the whole point of the Federal Reserve. It was enacted to protect the value of the dollar. Done just the exact opposite. It was never their intention. It was a lie right from the get-go. Okay? So, and two, again, like, was it Nancy said it? The Federal Reserve, we always assume that's part of the federal government. He says it's as federal as Federal Express. It's just a title. Yeah, it's instituted by the government, and yeah, it works hand in glove, but it's you scratch my back and I'll scratch yours. So the government works with the Federal Reserve and says, yeah, make sure and create some inflation because that's how the federal government gets money. Yes, Nancy?
Realize that it's really a private institution.
Yes, it is. And it's kind of a monopoly because it's government ordained. Okay, he talked about the value of a house. His grandfather in 1915 bought a house for $4,500. 50 years later, $45,000. Today, $450,000. Now, in truth, houses are a little more complicated and a little fancier than they were way back in 1915. However, basically, it has to do with inflation. It has to do with the plan of the government to take away our money, inflate money, and make us think that we're doing good in spite of what's going on. Okay, he says inflation is a tax. It's a hidden tax, and so it steals from people who have saved. And that's exactly what it does. So, it's almost as if to say, well, we don't care about the elderly. Right? That's really what it is. We're robbing from those who worked hard and saved money all their life so that when they get there, their money's not worth hardly anything, and they don't care. They don't care about that. Young people, they're going to be still working, and they're getting paid at the current rate, so it doesn't affect young people nearly as much as it does those, especially those who are retired. Okay? Talked about the value of gold. It buys 300 loaves one year and still does. Now, to be fair, the price of gold does fluctuate against our currency, against our dollar. It changes from time to time, and that's fine. But basically, essentially, he's saying over hundreds or even thousands of years, basically an ounce of gold does the same thing, essentially, in terms of buying power. And that hasn't changed a whole lot. And by the way, we have become entirely comfortable with inflation, haven't we? We don't even bat an eye. We just expect it. We're not shocked when the price of gasoline eases up a little bit. And, we grumble a little bit about, the price of food's a little more expensive, but nobody gets all upset. We have become so accustomed to it that we think it's normal and acceptable, not realizing that it is the government stealing from us all the time. Yes, Paul?
I was trying to figure out why an ounce of gold has the same value, and I guess it's because it's still a limited commodity, whereas the dollar is you print as many as you want. Can't do that with gold.
Yes. And what do you make of the fact that the Federal Reserve refuses to be audited? They don't want anyone to know how much money they're printing. We just have to find out, and the way we find out is when we go to the grocery store. That's how we find out how much they've inflated the currency. Is when commodities that we have in our mind, a loaf of bread should cost 29 cents. Remember when a loaf of bread cost 29 cents? How much does it cost now? $5. Is it because it's more expensive to produce wheat? No. Yes, Jim? You go to the store. So you give it back to them. And say, what? Right. Nothing. Yeah, sadly, but then even we oftentimes are kind of ignorant or passive to what's going on, to the point where even we don't, in many cases, know. So he says, if there's any doubt in the purposefulness of our economic situation, listen to this. Talking about John Maynard Keynes, who's really the guy that's designed our whole economic system in America. What he said was, by a continuing process of inflation, government can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. Lenin was certainly right. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch its currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. So, yesterday I spent a couple hours transcribing. And I got done and I said to Joan, I'm exhausted. I said, you know, it just takes all the energy out of you to realize what is going on and has been going on. And I also, I made the observation, why didn't we learn any of this when we were in college? We went to a Christian college. Why did we not learn any of this, of what's really, truly going on? And it's because the lie has been so effective, even though it's out in the open. Most of us are not really interested in reading communists and about their agenda and what they're trying to accomplish, so we've just ignored it. And we've ignored it for far too long, to the point where, sadly, almost everything they're trying to accomplish, they're already doing and have done. He says the second plank of the Communist Manifesto is to implement a graduated income tax. So the Federal Reserve was put in place in 1913, and the graduated income tax was put in place 1 year later, 1914. Yes, Jim? Did I give you? There you go.
And they've managed to exempt an awful lot of the population from any tax.
Yeah, right.
That's another way of enslaving.
Okay. And also, we hear all this talk about, well, we just need to increase the tax on the rich. It's a joke. It's a farce, because the rich already have reallocated their funds in such a way that they're not paying income tax. They have different ways of arriving at it. So even the rich guys are out saying, oh, yeah, we need to increase the income tax. It won't affect them. It's fraud. It's a lie. Yes, Paul?
Seems I remember learning in school that before Hitler came into power in Germany, inflation was the biggest factor. People were hauling a wheelbarrow load of money down to buy a loaf of bread.
Right. Right, exactly. So Dr. Alan Keyes raised the question, if the government establishes the percentage of your income that they're going to take, what percent of your income is under their control? 100%. Once they've established how much they're going to get, then you don't have anything more you can do about it, do you? You're just under their control. Remind us your name.
My name's Brandy.
Brady.
Brandy.
Brandy, right.
Part of the inflation also is our own fault, not just the government, right? Because anytime we use credit cards to buy things that we actually can't afford, then the company goes, oh, they can afford it, let's make it more expensive, like cell phones and cars and all of that stuff. So it's kind of weird, because we all actually play a part in that too.
Especially if we don't pay off the balance every month.
Right.
Especially if we pay off the balance every month, we kind of are playing a fast one on them, in a way, right? But so many people end up with thousands of dollars in debt on their credit card. All right, good point. Thank you, Brandy. Ron's daughter, Ron and Brenda's daughter. Good to have you. Okay? So let's see here. Vladimir Lenin said, taxation with its offspring inflation is the vital weapon to displace the system of free enterprise. So we've been doing it for over 100 years now. And guess what? It's gradually, it's like planting bamboo. We lived in Brazil in the Amazon. Last thing in the world you want to do is plant bamboo. But you plant bamboo and you forget that it starts growing and multiplying like grass. And it's not so easy to get rid of. And that's what we've done with taxation and with the Federal Reserve in America. We've made ourselves a slave, and the government tells us how much we can live on, how much we get to keep. All right? So, another thing. People wonder why our free enterprise system isn't working anymore. And what that triggered in my mind right away is our college students. So they go to colleges, secular colleges, and they're taught basically socialism. And then on top of it, to prove the point, they're taught, just look at how much it costs you to go to college. That should be free. And now you've got all this debt. And besides that, when you get out, you won't even be able to get a good job and pay it off. Oh yeah, and they're sitting there going, oh yeah. And they don't realize that the government, the very government that's providing them the loans and all that, is doing it on purpose to make them slaves of the state. I always think it's sad when you talk to a young person, you say, well, they're finishing high school, what are you going to do? I'm going to go to college. Oh, which college are you going to go to? I don't know. Well, what are you going to study? I don't know. Well, wait a minute. Why would you go to college if you don't even know why you're going to college? Well, that's just what you're supposed to do. You got to be kidding me. A choice of a college should be made based on the choice of what you're going to do. Why would you choose to go to a college that specializes in basket weaving if you want to be an engineer? The choice of the college depends on what the outcome, what you desire to come out of it with. First Barbara, and then that microphone. Right.
Now everybody has to go, or you're stupid.
Right.
You know, your kid isn't going to college. What's wrong with you? They should be.
Right. There's a stigma attached if you don't, but have we even thought about why? Why that's true or not true?
Of our society.
Well, and it's part of the brainwashing that we've willingly accepted.
But they have so much pressure on these kids by the age of 16 to know what they want to do. And they honestly don't. My daughters, who just graduated from college, were under so much pressure and stress amongst all the testing and everything, but to figure out what they want to do the rest of their life, they honestly don't know what they want to do.
Right.
And they're still figuring that out. So they have to pick something thinking they might be interested by someone guiding their views their whole life, and they're still changing it once they get in college because they don't know.
Right. So how is it going to work out if a person goes into it without knowing, and yet they're just doing this, assuming that that's going to somehow make it better? I mean, the people that go to college with a real mission, I want to do college for this reason, are the ones that have the most chance of coming out the other side and actually accomplishing something because of that college education, because they had a reason, a motive. But so many students want to go in there and just, mingle, which is absolutely dangerous. It's not even healthy. And so, and besides that, then we have socialist professors brainwashing them in the process. It's really a combination for disaster. Yeah, Joe? Right.
And so they're going to school and getting worthless degrees, and
we're actually at the point where there are some businesses that actually prefer a student that has not been to college. We're really to that point.
I would rather teach them hands-on than...
Not only that, so many college students go to college and just drift through, and they come out and they're worthless in the workforce because they have an entitlement attitude. So it's an interesting thing, the point that we've come to. He says, the borrower is servant to the lender. That's what God says. Artificially low interest rates have encouraged everyone to be buried in debt and enslaved to the banks. When you penalize productivity and reward sloth, You know exactly what you're doing. You're making us poorer as a nation, which will create more dependency. So we're at a point in time where literally there is a plot to teach our young people to be dependent on government, to be dependent on the state. And again, I am not opposed to a college education. My goodness, I have a master's degree. But not having a purpose and just going to college to try and find ourselves and spending thousands of dollars. I tell every so often I'll tell a young person finishing high school, you'd be better off to go to work at Dutch Brothers, save your money tenaciously, and after 2 or 3 years or whatever it is that their requirement of working there, work on buying your own franchise, starting your own franchise. And you can come out way better than if you ever went to college for 4 years, especially if you start at Sierra College.
Well, and we've done away with trade school.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't take a PhD to run a welder.
True.
And welders make very good money.
Right.
Boilermakers make 6 figures and they have no education. They go to classes.
Right.
I mean,
Right,
there are
right.
so many things
There's
out
all
there
kinds
that,
of examples like that.
Right.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Okay, Rusty, let's go ahead and run educational disinformation here, and then we'll talk about that before we're done.
If you look at how do you change society, well, one of the things you obviously do is you go after the next generation. And you do that through the education system, and that's exactly what has happened to us. The Marxist movement in America has done exactly that.
The education system establishes the direction for the future. It sets the hearts and the minds, the perspectives of the next generation. Everybody knows how important it is.
They know that if they can get control of our children and they can pump their ideology into these young, hungry brains, they virtually can have them captive as prisoners for life.
And you're doing it all under the banner of being internationally competitive or college ready or career ready. So the euphemisms hide the actual intent.
The father of global education, Robert Mueller, was the Assistant Secretary General of the United Nations and the creator of the World Core Curriculum. He said the goal was, quote, to promote growth of the group idea so that group good, group understanding, group interrelations, and group goodwill will lead to group consciousness, unquote. His World Core curriculum was pushed in America by George Bush Sr. as America 2000, which was renamed by Bill Clinton Goals 2000, which was then given a facelift to become George Bush Jr.'s No Child Left Behind, which was the driving force behind Barack Obama's Common Core. It's all the same thing, Republican or Democrat, progressing down the same road of complete brainwashing. Since John Dewey, the entire focus of education by the elites has been to, as quickly as possible, move the children to a collectivist mindset. The 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto states, provide a free education by the state for all children and to combine education with industrial production. Bill Gates has teamed up with the United Nations to build the model that will have our schools simply be a tax-paid training ground for corporate America.
In the end, most of this tracks back to people who would benefit financially from a more government-centric economy because they're at table. They're already political players. They don't want to worry about competition.
Not only is competition eliminated, but employees are created. The type that would be content to work 60 or 70 hours a week in a dead-end corporate job that just paid enough to survive. Traditionally, Americans would have had no interest in that. They would have wanted to use all the individual talents and abilities that God had given them. They wanted to do 100 different things in their life, invent things, start new businesses, change the world. And the elites didn't want any of that, so it had to be destroyed.
It's like we're going after Marx's vision and at the same time making it impossible as well, because the mind arson necessary to get an amenable voter means that the wealth that you're planning on redistributing is really gone. You just don't know it yet.
Just as I was beginning to dig in, I realized I was making a big mistake. The temptation on all these different issues is to not accept the reality of how things really are. The bottom line is, our enemies are in control of the schools, so there is no fix. I know you don't want to hear that because I don't want to hear that, but it's true. They want our kids to be useful idiots. They want them to be dependent on the state. That's the goal of the whole thing. So they will repackage, rename, rebrand the same old thing over and over again. It is intentionally going downhill. We have to grasp this. It is purposeful. We legitimize them by acting like they just don't have a good idea and we have a better one. They know exactly what they are doing. They want to create a new world man that is dependent on government for his very existence. So to even talk about Common Core, debating its good points or bad points, is playing into their plan of sidetracking all of our energies and efforts on a dead-end road. Even without Common Core, the schools are completely bankrupt and destroying our children. We have seen a decline now for 70 straight years without any interruption. As long as the government has a monopoly in education, we will keep getting what we have.
And the end result is to make our children and those educated under this influence, to make them unfit to govern themselves.
Okay, educational disinformation. What strikes you, first of all? All of it, right? Okay. In order to change society and move us in a socialist direction, they knew that they had to grab the educational system, and they've done it. And so they're moving us in this direction. And it establishes the future direction we're going. I'm sorry? So they do it under the guise of being competitive or college ready or career ready. But it's a euphemism, and it's just like all the other things they do. It's just the opposite of what they're really trying to accomplish. So Common Core today is just a result of a whole series of steps that go all the way back, and we've been progressing for years. So what is the solution when it comes to the education of our children? Nancy? Homeschooling. It's being outlawed? They're trying, aren't they? Okay? No. All right? The 10th plank of the Communist Manifesto states, provide a free education by the state for all children and to combine education with industrial production. Not only education, 3 meals. Started out with breakfast, right? Started out with you get breakfast. You can get breakfast because, you can't expect a child to study if he didn't have breakfast. You can't expect him to learn. He's got an unfair disadvantage. So now they provide him all the meals, all of them. And then the kids come and they're overweight and they're throwing it in the garbage because they don't want to eat bad. They want, Doritos or whatever. It's like, you can't make this up. Wow, what have we done? What have we come to? So it used to be in America that we tried to be entrepreneurs and we sought to something other than just getting stuck in a job somewhere. What percentage of Americans even like their jobs? Of the young people, probably not very many. A lot of them just don't. All right? So he says with regard to the education and what they're doing, they want our kids to be useful idiots. They want them to be dependent on the state. That's the goal of the whole thing. And so they'll repackage it, rename it, rebrand it. But it's intentional. They know exactly what they're doing. And we legitimize them by saying, well, maybe they don't know what they're doing. Maybe we just have to have a better idea. And that's not the case at all. All right? So they want to create people that are dependent on government, and that's where we're going. Okay? Any other observations before we... Yes, Paul?
Yeah, I noticed now, just as they said in promoting slothfulness, now there's a big push to start school later in the morning so kids get more rest.
Because they're up all night on their cell phones. Yep. Nancy?
I didn't mean to leave out the Christian school. A good Christian school is a good thing, but the problem is that some of them are forced into state curriculum, and you know, only a teacher that's wise to that will, you know, handle
Right.
that.
Well, and so it depends on having Christian teachers,
That's right.
who not just in name only, but really
Right.
have Christian values. Huh? There's a big difference, isn't there? Exactly. Okay? Yes, Joan?
So in the 60s, early 60s, so for the most part, we have all been educated under this same thing. But I remember Mom saying that, and Mom had she graduated from high school, Dad did not, but Mom said, well, they must know. And they were literally telling, PTAs were telling, well, we're the educators and you just don't understand. But a generation later, too, now, you're realizing that we're still allowing them to tell us that they're the educators.
Right.
And we're not doing anything about it. We do have an option. We can get into that public school with notice and find out what they're teaching. And, you know, I look at Rockland and I'm just, little Rockland.
Right.
I'm appalled. It's horrible what they're teaching.
But again, I think the majority of Christian families do like what we did on a furlough from Brazil. And we tried to have our kids in the school up in Portland, Oregon. And first of all, the SAT scores were plunging. And they're fixing it. All the time, they're fixing what was broken, and it's getting worse, not better. If you're fixing something, you expect it to get better, not worse. No, they would fix it, and it would be worse than it was before they fixed it. And that's the way it just constantly went. And so here we are with our SAT. So what do? We change the SAT to make it easier so that we won't have such bad scores. And it's just insane what has happened. Huh? Right. 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 Okay, Rusty, it's just a short section. Does education affect politics?
We wonder why it's hard to get a good candidate anymore for President of the United States. Well, let me show you how education affects politics. In 1980, there were approximately 40% of Americans that were conservative, 10% liberal, and 50% undecided. And since even our numbers show that they are capturing 85% of our young people each year through the educational system, this is how it plays out. In 2012, America was divided at 30% conservative and 30% liberal, with 40% undecided. By 2028, it will be 20% conservative, 50% liberal, and 30% undecided. And by 2036, only 20 years from now, it will be 10% conservative, 70% liberal, and 20% undecided. This is simply demographics, and there is no quick fix to change this. 2016 is the last election in my lifetime where it will even be possible to get an actual conservative elected.
Okay. So we can stop it right there. What's the time on the thing, Rusty? 30 minutes? Okay. 38:16. So obviously he was making this leading up to the election in 2016. So the move in the demographics, have you, I'm sure you have, made the connection about the change from conservative to liberal that's going on in the nation in general compared to what's happening to Christianity in America? Same thing. Very same thing is happening. When you come out with a statistic from the Southern Baptist Church that 85% of their young people raised in the Southern Baptist Church, when they hit the end of high school, are walking away from the faith. 85%! Okay, so whose job is it to make sure that our children are Christians? Well, it's back to us, doesn't it? And I know we got everything working against us. And the enemy is working against us, and Satan is working against us. But at some point, we've got to realize that, and by the way, again, what can we do? Here we are, at my age, sometimes I play soccer with the guys, and someone says, I got to go pick up my kids. I go, yeah, I got to write a letter to my grandkids, all 12 of them. And they go, what? Yeah. So we're past most of us are past the age of having our own children. But we have grandchildren, or we have children who are raising children, or children who are raising children who are raising children. And, I really believe we need to get them educated. We need to get them up to speed on what's really happening. And this is a political issue, but it's a spiritual issue. And if we allow this to continue, this trend, our grandchildren will be, if they remain believers themselves, will be a tiny, tiny fraction of the population of this country. And at some point, we have got to, well, you know what we really need? We need to get down on our knees and cry out to God. This pattern has repeated itself in history over and over and over. We can see it in the nation of Israel in the Old Testament over and over and over. When God's people slide away from an active, vibrant faith in God, then this is what happens. And it leads to destruction every time. All right? Somebody have a final comment or two? Yes, Randy?
Yeah, most of my friends grew up Christian, and most of them are not anymore. And so I kind of watched the statistic happen in my life as my friends went one by one, college or even Christian college, brainwashed, gone. And it's crazy.
So, Brandy, what would you really attribute the difference to?
You mean for me?
Between you and them?
That's hard. Yeah, I mean, definitely, I guess, a firm foundation. And yeah, I think that's probably the main, and a stable family life, I think.
Okay.
A lot of my other friends either had parents that were divorced or just a lot of family strife and stuff like that.
Okay.
So.
All right, good. Okay, any other observations? Jim Dowling, you're sitting there, you haven't said a word. Who's got a mic? Thank you. That's what I thought. You just need to be...
Yeah, I'm absorbing all of this, and I'm thinking back to when I used to fly around the state in the 70s, and you get on a plane and it would say, we're part of the Global Alliance. So globalism is not going to go away. We know biblically that we're going to have an antichrist, and it's going to develop from a socialistic government.
Yep.
So what are we doing at this particular time? And I remember Alan Keyes at one of the previous elections said, America has a moral problem. That's it. That's the real basic issue.
Yeah.
So we have got to deal with our relationship to the Lord and how we carry out the Great Commission and make disciples. That's all we can do. And we need to push back against the LGBT issues that are impacting our family and not get discouraged, because this is going to happen.
Yes.
I mean, we can slow it down maybe a little bit, but it's going to happen.
Yes.
So I tell people, cheer up, it's going to get worse. And so we cheer up because we're Christians and we have hope.
Yes.
And this has been going on for years. I mean, the inflation issue and taking control of our students. I fought against it in the 70s about they were changing the curriculum and trying to get rid of mother and father. And they said, well, we'll never have homosexual teachers.
Yeah.
And when I went before the school board, only one other pastor showed up with me, and they voted us out. I mean, they said, no, we don't agree. So that's back in the 70s, and it's gotten, exponentially worse.
Yeah.
So I'm not discouraged by all this. I think, we talk about the Lord coming, and at the same time, we're going to go through difficulties, and I really feel that we need to be encouraged that this is coming to an end. Okay, that's my thought.
All right. So be back in 15 minutes for the next service, because we're going to talk about our part, what our part is, and because there is something we can do, but we got to get serious about it. All right.